October 1943. Over central Germany. 25,000 feet above the ground. The temperature outside the aircraft is far below zero. Frost creeps along the inside of metal skin. The constant vibration of 4 engines fills the airframe, a deep mechanical pulse that never stops. Oxygen masks hiss softly as the crew breathes thin air, each man locked into his own narrow space. Inside the B-17, there is no horizon, only cloud, sunlight, and altitude. Then the warning comes. Small black shapes rise from below the formation, then more, then dozens. The sky ahead begins to move in ways it should not. German fighters climb aggressively, spreading out, positioning themselves with precision. 42 aircraft, single-engine interceptors. Closing fast. Tracer fire streaks past the cockpit. Flak bursts bloom dark and sudden nearby. The bomber shudders as fragments strike its fuselage. At one gun position, a lone American gunner does something unexpected. He does not fire immediately. He does not spray the sky with tracers the way training suggests. He waits, adjusts, controls his fire in a way few others dare under pressure to anyone watching. It looks wrong, but as the swarm tightens and the Luftwaffe commits fully to the attack, that decision begins to reshape the fight, unfolding at altitude 1 burst at a time and in the frozen air over Germany. Standard procedure is about to give way to something far more effective. By the autumn of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal turning point. The United States Army Air Forces were committed to daylight precision bombing. Unlike the RAF's night raids, American doctrine insisted that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could defend themselves while striking industrial targets deep inside Germany. It was a theory built on firepower, discipline, and belief in the bomber's resilience. The aircraft at the center of this doctrine was the B-17 Flying Fortress, braced with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns and flown by crews of 10. The B-17 was designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. In formation, overlapping fields of fire were supposed to create a defensive box that enemy fighters could not penetrate without unacceptable losses. In practice, reality was far harsher. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had refined its interceptor tactics. German pilots no longer attacked bombers individually. They coordinated mass assaults, approaching from multiple directions, often head-on. Where bomber defenses were weakest and closure speeds were highest, German fighter bases across Central Europe launched interceptors in waves, Messersch, MIT, Bf-109S, and Focke-Wulf FW-190**S, climbing hard to altitude, timed to hit bomber streams as they crossed into defended airspace. When escorts were absent or forced to turn back due to fuel limits, the bombers were alone, and often they were overwhelmed. Losses mounted rapidly. Missions like the Schweinfurt-Gansberg raids revealed a grim truth. Defensive fire alone was not enough. Bombers could be damaged faster than they could defend themselves, especially when fighters pressed attacks aggressively and accepted losses to break formations. Inside the bombers, crews understood this, even if doctrine resisted it. Gunners tracked dozens of fast-moving targets simultaneously. Ammunition was limited, barrels overheated. Visibility changed constantly as clouds, smoke, and flak obscured sidelines. Firing too early wasted rounds. Firing too late invited collision. The psychological strain was immense. Men watched fighters burn, spiral, or disappear into cloud, but also watched fellow bombers explode or fall away, leaving gaps in formations that attracted even more attackers. Every loss increased pressure on those remaining. By October 1943, the daylight bombing campaign was reaching its breaking point. Fighter escorts that could stay with bombers all the way to target had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers. Until they did, survival depended on discipline, judgment, and decisions made by individuals under impossible stress. It was within this fragile balance between doctrine and reality that one gunner's approach began to matter. Because when 42 fighters rose to meet a single bomber, success would not depend on volume of fire but on how and when that fire was used. Life inside a B-17 under attack was defined by confinement and responsibility. Each crew member occupied a fixed position, separated by bulkheads, bomb bays, and narrow crawl spaces. Pilots focused on formation and altitude. Navigators watched headings. Bombardiers stared forward through plexiglass noses already spiderwebbed by frost. And scattered throughout the fuselage, gunners stood alone at their station's waist. Tail, top turret, ball turret each guarding a slice of sky. They could not see the whole battle. They could only see what came toward them. Defensive doctrine emphasized immediate response. When fighters appeared, gunners were trained to open fire early, using tracers to warn attackers and force them to break off. The idea was deterrence through volume. Fill the air with lead, deny approach lanes, protect the formation. But this approach had limits. A .50 caliber machine gun carried immense stopping power, yet ammunition was finite. Each gunner had only a few hundred rounds readily accessible. Barrels overheated quickly. Recoil shook the aircraft. At high closure speeds, a burst fired seconds too early passed harmlessly behind a fighter that had not yet committed. Worse, constant firing created predictability. German pilots learned to read tracer streams, adjust timing, and slip through gaps in coverage. Head-on attacks exploited blind spots and reduced the time gunners had to react. A fighter closing at hundreds of miles per hour gave a gunner only seconds to decide fire now or wait. Waiting felt unnatural. Fear pushed hands toward triggers. Silence under attack felt like failure. Many gunners fired simply to feel they were doing anything against the swarm. The environment amplified stress. At 25,000 feet. Oxygen deprivation dulled judgment. Cold numbed fingers. Frost crept across sight glass. Flak bursts shook concentration. Each explosion a reminder that death did not always come with warning. Inside this chaos, discipline was fragile. Some gunners exhausted ammunition early. Others fired wildly, chasing targets across the sky rather than controlling a sector. Coordination between positions broke down as fighters attacked from multiple angles. Simultaneously, yet experience taught a quieter lesson. Fighters that committed fully closing to effective range were the ones most vulnerable. A short, well-timed burst at close distance did far more damage than long sprays at extreme range. Restraint conserved ammunition, preserved barrel life, and denied the enemy information about where defenses were strongest. This required nerve. Holding fire while enemy aircraft closed felt like inviting death. It demanded trust in training, in judgment, and in the belief that control could outweigh instinct. Most gunners struggled with this under pressure, but one gunner, facing an attack that would involve 42 fighters against a single bomber, chose control over reflex. He treated the sky not as chaos, but as a sequence targets entering range one by one, each demanding precision rather than panic. As the fighters closed in tighter formations and the attack intensified, his method would be tested not in theory, but in survival. And with the first passes already beginning, the difference between noise and effect was about to become painfully clear. For a gunner, fear arrived before the enemy did. It began as vibration changing pitch as pilots adjusted power. Then came radio warnings passed quickly, clipped and urgent. Finally, the shapes appeared, small at first, then unmistakable. At a gun position, there was nowhere to retreat. The gunner stood exposed behind thin metal and plexiglass, separated from open air by inches. Below him, nothing but altitude. Around him, the steady hiss of oxygen and the rattle of cold metal. His world narrowed to a ring sight and the space beyond it. Tunnel vision set in quickly. Hands tightened. Breathing shortened. Time felt distorted, seconds stretching, minutes collapsing. Training echoed faintly. But instinct shouted louder. Fire now. Fire before they get closer. This pressure broke discipline more often than doctrine admitted. Many gunners fired simply to relieve fear. Tracers streaked outward like reassurance. The act of firing gave a sense of control. Even when it accomplished little. The gunner who held his fire fought not just the enemy, but himself. Restraint required emotional control under conditions designed to destroy it. He watched fighters grow larger in his sight. He waited as engines screamed and tracers from other bombers filled the air. He accepted the discomfort of doing nothing while danger approached. This was not courage in the dramatic sense. It was patience under threat. Isolation amplified the burden. Other gunners were voices on intercoms. not visible allies. Each man fought his own war inside the same aircraft. The gunner's decision to wait did not come from bravado. It came from experience watching earlier missions where firing too early wasted ammunition and revealed defensive arcs without stopping attacks. He trusted his judgment over his fear. And as the first, German fighters committed fully to their attack runs that trust would be tested in the most unforgiving way possible. 2. The tactical angle, 250 to 300 words. Luftwaffe fighter attacks were built on compression and shock. German pilots understood that bombers were hardest to destroy when defenses were alert and coordinated. The goal of mass attacks was to overwhelm that coordination to force gunners into constant firing, drain ammunition, and create openings. Head-on attacks were especially effective. Approaching from directly ahead minimized exposure time. Closure speeds were extreme, leaving gunners only moments to react. If a bomber's defenses fired too early, German pilots could time their final approach to pass through tracer streams after the guns fell silent. Swarm tactics magnified this effect. Dozens of fighters attacked in overlapping waves. While one group drew fire, another closed from a different angle. Defensive fire became scattered, reactive, and inefficient. The gunner's method disrupted this rhythm by holding fire until fighters entered optimal range. He denied attackers early feedback. There were no tracer streams to read, no warning of where defenses were concentrated. Fighters committed without adjustment. When he fired, it was sudden and precise. Short bursts. Tight control. Fire placed not where fighters were, but where they would be. This forced attackers to break off abruptly, often too late to avoid damage. The effect rippled outward. Fighters that survived pulled away earlier on subsequent passes. Attack timing broke down. Coordination suffered as pilots reacted individually rather than as a unit. This was not about shooting down dozens of aircraft. It was about altering behavior. A disrupted attack was a failed attack. By refusing to participate in the predictable rhythm of defensive fire, the gunner turned a swarm into a series of isolated threats, manageable on its own. As the number of attacking fighters grew, this tactical advantage became increasingly important. The sky was filling fast. Angle 3. The weapon gunnery angle, 250 to 300 words. The .50 caliber machine gun was unforgiving. It rewarded discipline and punished excess. Each burst heated the barrel. Each second of firing consumed ammunition that could not be replaced until landing if the aircraft survived. Tracers served a dual purpose. They helped aim, but they also revealed position. A stream of tracers told an attacker exactly where fire was coming from and when it would stop. Experienced German pilots learned to exploit this. They waited. They counted. They attacked when guns went quiet. The gunner's method minimized this advantage by firing only at close range. He reduced tracer visibility. His bursts were brief, controlled, and unpredictable. Instead of a constant stream, attackers encountered sudden flashes, too late to avoid, too late to adjust, mechanically. This preserved effectiveness. Barrels stayed cooler. Accuracy improved. Ammunition lasted longer. More importantly, each burst carried intent rather than desperation. The weapon became an instrument of decision rather than reaction. This approach required confidence in the gun itself and in one's own ability to judge distance and lead under pressure. It also required accepting that some attackers would pass unchallenged in. They crossed the invisible line of effective fire. Not every gunner could do this, but for the one facing 42 fighters, it was the only way to survive the coming minutes. Because the swarm was no longer forming, it was already there, and with the first passes beginning to converge on the bomber. The difference between controlled fire and chaos would soon decide everything inside a bomber under attack. Leadership fragmented. Pilots flew the aircraft, navigators tracked position, bombardiers prepared for targets. But during a fighter swarm, no single voice could control the fight. Each gunner became a leader of one, responsible for a sector, a weapon, and a decision that could not be overseen or corrected in real time. Orders did not arrive at gun positions during combat. There was no countdown. No command to fire or hold doctrine existed, but doctrine was distant. What remained was judgment. The gunner who chose restraint accepted responsibility that usually belonged to officers. He decided when to engage, how much ammunition to expend, and when to let an attacker pass. If he misjudged distance or timing, the consequence would be immediate shattered plexiglass, wounded crew, or worse. Leadership at altitude was solitary. There was no applause for discipline, only consequences for failure by refusing to fire. Early, the gunner shielded not just his own position, but the aircraft's defensive integrity. His controlled bursts reduced friendly confusion, preserved ammunition for others, and prevented the entire bomber from becoming a constant beacon of tracer fire. This was leadership expressed through restraint. He did not dominate the fight. He shaped it quietly by limiting noise, reducing panic, and forcing attackers to commit without information. In the chaos of a 42-fighter attack, such control mattered more than aggression, because leadership, in its most essential form, is not about action alone. It is about choosing when action matters. Angle 5. The Enemy Perspective. Luftwaffe. 250 to 300 words. German pilots entered mass attacks expecting a pattern. They anticipated early tracer fire. They timed approaches to exploit pauses. They trusted that bombers, under pressure, would reveal their defenses long before fighters entered effective range. When that pattern failed, confusion followed. The bomber they attacked did not respond as expected. Tracers did not stream outward immediately. Defensive arcs remained silent longer than doctrine predicted. Pilots committed to head-on and quartering attacks without the usual visual cues. Then the fire came. Sudden, accurate, close-dot. Fighters broke off sharply, sometimes too late. Others aborted attacks prematurely, uncertain where the next burst would come from. The absence of predictable defensive fire disrupted coordination across the swarm. Mass attacks relied on timing, when individual pilots adjusted, independently breaking early, extending to long, or misjudging closure formations. Fractured communication became reactive rather than planned. Leaders struggled to synchronize follow-up passes. The effect was not dramatic destruction. It was hesitation. Hesitation at altitude was lethal. Pilots trained to press attacks now faced uncertainty. Was the bomber lightly defended or waiting? Was this a trap? Could ammunition be conserved for another pass? These questions cost seconds, and seconds, in air combat, separated survival from impact. The gunner's restraint introduced doubt where confidence had been expected. That doubt rippled through the attacking force, dulling the sharp edge of mass assault. Angle 6. The moral survival angle. 250 to 300 words. Survival in air combat was not purely technical. It was moral, in the quietest sense, about discipline under terror. Every instinct urged the gunner to fire, to fill the sky with lead, to push danger away through noise and motion. Resisting that instinct required accepting vulnerability, allowing enemies to approach closer than felt safe. This choice carried moral weight. If restraint failed, the gunner would bear responsibility not just for his own fate, but for the lives of the crew around him. Holding fire meant trusting that precision would arrive in time. That trust was earned, not assumed. It came from understanding limits of weapons, of ammunition, of human endurance. It came from acknowledging that fear-driven action often wasted the very resources needed to survive the longest. In this sense, restraint became an ethical decision, not passive, not hesitant, but deliberate. The gunner chose to fight the battle he could win, not the one fear demanded. He accepted the discomfort of silence, so that action, when it came, would matter. This approach did not guarantee victory. Nothing in air combat did, but it preserved agency. Asterisk, as the swarm pressed closer, with fighters attacking from multiple directions and the bomber shuddering under near misses. The moral clarity of that choice would soon be tested beyond theory, because now doctrine and angles and preparation collapsed into the only thing that mattered. What happened when 42 fighters finally committed all at once? The sky was no longer filling. It was full, and with the first coordinated wave breaking toward the bomber, the moment arrived when restraint would either hold or fail completely. October 1943. Minutes before the target run, the first wave came head-on. German fighters dropped their noses and accelerated, engines screaming as they closed the distance at terrifying speed. From the cockpit, the pilot saw them only as flashes, dark shapes growing impossibly fast. From the gunner's position, they filled the ring sight in seconds. Other bombers opened fire immediately. Tracer streams crossed the sky in frantic patterns. long bursts, constant fire. The air ahead of the formation glowed with streaks of red and white, revealing every defensive arc long before the attackers reached lethal range. Asterisk, the gunner did not fire. He tracked the lead fighter smoothly, letting it grow larger, closer, sharper. He ignored the instinct to squeeze the trigger early. He waited until the aircraft crossed the invisible boundary where lead, range, and closure aligned. Then he fired. A short burst, controlled, precise dot. The fighter jolted violently and broke away, rolling hard out of the attack path. A second aircraft followed immediately behind it. The gunner adjusted slightly and fired again. Another brief burst. No wasted motion. The attack line fractured as the first wave passed. Fighters behind them hesitated, unsure why the bomber had not responded earlier. That hesitation disrupted timing. Instead of clean intervals, the next passes arrived unevenly, some too early, others too late. The gunner stayed disciplined. He ignored distant aircraft. He let fighters approach deeper into his sector before engaging. Each burst came late, sudden, and decisive. Tracers appeared only at the moment of danger, not before. Around him, the aircraft shook under near misses. Cannon shells tore through empty sections of fuselage. Plexiglass cracked at another station. Intercom chatter spiked with shouted warnings. Still, he waited. Another group attacked from a shallow angle. He tracked the closest threat, fired once, then stopped. The barrel stayed cool. Ammunition counters barely moved. The effect compounded. German pilots, expecting early fire, committed to deeply before realizing where the danger lay. Breakoffs became sharper. Attack angles widened. Coordination slipped. The sky was crowded. Now fighters everywhere, some passing so close their markings were visible. The bomber shuddered as flak bursts detonated nearby, each explosion stealing breath and focus. The gunner's hands remained steady. He did not chase targets. He let them enter. He fired only when hits were possible. Each burst forced another fighter to disengage violently, breaking rhythm across the swarm. Minutes passed this way long. Breathless minutes were restraint held against instinct. But the Luftwaffe was not finished. A second mass wave began forming, tighter, more aggressive. Pilots pressing closer together in an attempt to overwhelm defenses through sheer proximity. 42 fighters had engaged. Now they were committing fully. And, as the next wave aligned for a coordinated assault, the outcome of the gunner's method would be decided not by theory, but by whether it could break the attack completely. The second wave came from multiple directions at once. Fighters split high and low, some diving steeply, others sliding in, from oblique angles designed to stretch the bomber's defenses past their limits. Cannon fire flashed. Tracers snapped past the cockpit. The aircraft shuddered as fragments struck aluminum skin. This was the moment mass attacks were meant to win. The gunner stayed with his method. He ignored the noise. He ignored distant flashes. He watched only the aircraft that committed, those that crossed into the narrow space where speed and proximity could no longer protect them. He fired late. Each burst was measured to the second. Fighters that expected a final, empty glide into firing position instead met sudden resistance at the closest possible range. Breakoffs became violent. One aircraft rolled inverted to escape. Another dove sharply, abandoning its run entirely. Coordination collapsed. Pilots no longer attacked in clean sequence. Some pressed too early, others too late. Several aborted before reaching effective range, uncertain where fire would come from next. The sky filled with motion, but lost its pattern. Inside the bomber, the difference was tangible. The pressure eased not because the threat vanished, but because it fractured. Attacks arrived singly rather than in waves. Gunners at other positions adjusted instinctively, conserving ammunition as they saw the effect of restraint. The aircraft absorbed damage but remained controllable. Engines held. Control surfaces responded. No fire spread unchecked. Minutes passed, then more. What should have been a decisive swarm became a series of failed approaches. Fighters peeled away to regroup. Some disengaged entirely. Fuel and ammunition spent without result. The gunner's ammunition supply remained largely intact when the final fighters broke contact and turned away. The silence that followed felt unnatural. Only engine noise remained, steady and unbroken. The bomber stayed in formation, scarred but alive. 42 fighters had attacked. None had broken the aircraft. The Luftwaffe's method overwhelm through mass had failed, not because of superior firepower, but because its rhythm had been disrupted at the exact point where timing mattered most. Inside the aircraft, there was no celebration, only breathing, only the quiet realization that discipline had outlasted terror. As the bomber continued toward its target, the gunner reset his stance and scanned his sector again, knowing the war was not finished only this moment. And as the formation pressed on through hostile airspace, the consequences of that method began to ripple outward beyond a single aircraft and a single fight. The bomber landed hours later with daylight fading behind it. Ground crews counted holes in the fuselage and wings evidence of how close the aircraft had come to destruction. Plexiglass panels were cracked. Control cables showed signs of near misses. But the structure held. Tensions were intact. The crew walked away. In the debriefing room, facts replaced fear. Crews compared notes. Reports of mass fighter attacks were common that day, but this bomber stood out. Its survival was noted not for the number of enemy aircraft destroyed, but for the way the attack had broken apart before achieving its purpose. The gunner was questioned. Quietly, how much ammunition had he used? At what range had he fired? Why had he held fire so long? The answers were plain and unemotional. He described waiting until effective range, firing short bursts, avoiding tracers until necessary, treating each attack as a single problem rather than part of a swarm. There was no reprimand. There was no formal praise either in the air war. Outcomes mattered more than explanations. The bomber had survived an attack that should have overwhelmed it. That fact carried weight. Other gunners listened, not because they were ordered to, but because survival spoke louder than instruction. Men who had fired until barrels glowed began reconsidering how they used their weapons. Discipline spread not through memos, but through conversation. German losses were difficult to confirm. Some fighters were seen breaking off trailing smoke. Others disappeared into cloud. What mattered was not the count, but the effect. The attack had failed. The formation reached its target. Bombs were released. The mission continued. For the Luftwaffe, it was another costly engagement in a campaign that was grinding them down. For the bomber crews, it was proof that survival depended not only on courage, but on control. As the aircraft was repaired and prepared for another mission, the lesson lingered, not written down, not codified, but understood. Sometimes, doing less achieved more. The air war did not change overnight. Daylight bombing remained dangerous. Losses continued. Doctrine shifted slowly, often lagging behind what crews already knew. But experiences like this one accumulated quietly, shaping behavior one mission at a time. Gunnery training began to emphasize fire discipline more strongly. Instructors spoke less about constant deterrence and more about effective range. Ammunition conservation became a priority rather than an afterthought. These changes were not traced to one bomber or one gunner. They emerged from repetition. Across Europe, crews discovered the same truth independently, that overwhelming noise did not equal overwhelming effect. That restraint, under the right conditions, disrupted attackers more than panic ever could. The arrival of long-range escorts would later transform the air war. Fighters that could stay with bombers deep into Germany reduced the burden on defensive gunners and shifted the balance decisively. But until that change fully took hold, bomber survival rested in the hands of individuals making split-second decisions. The Luftwaffe, too, adapted. German pilots adjusted attack methods, tried new formations, experimented with heavier weapons and different angles. But fuel shortages, attrition, and the growing presence of Allied fighters narrowed their options. The war moved on. The gunner returned to his place in the rotation. Another mission, another climb to altitude, another day of waiting for shapes to appear in the distance. His method was not named. It was not formalized. It simply became part of how experienced men fought. History would record the air war in numbers: our craft lost, targets destroyed, campaigns won. It would not record the moments where restraint changed outcomes. Those moments lived only in memory. But they mattered because in the thin air over Germany, surrounded by hostile sky, survival often depended not on how much firepower one could unleash, but on knowing exactly when to use it. And that understanding would carry bomber crews through the most dangerous months of the war, the air war of World War II is often remembered as a clash of machines, bombers against fighters. Steel against steel, production against production. But inside those machines were men, confronting fear at 25,000 feet with no margin for error. The gunner, who faced 42 attackers, did not defeat them through aggression. He defeated their method by refusing to fire on instinct. He denied the enemy information. By waiting, he forced attackers to commit blind. By controlling his weapon, he turned chaos into sequence. This was not heroism in the cinematic sense. It was judgment under pressure. Asterisk history favors dramatic victories, aircraft exploding, formations breaking apart. But the quieter victories mattered just as much. A bomber that survives denies the enemy success. A mission completed shifts the balance incrementally. A lesson learned saves lives later. In the long arc of the war, escort fighters and overwhelming numbers would decide the air campaign. But before that tipping point arrived, survival rested on discipline at the smallest level. One gunner, one weapon, one decision repeated again and again. The lesson endures beyond. World War II, technology changes. Speed increases. Weapons grow more complex. Fear remains constant. So does the temptation to react rather than decide. In that frozen sky over Germany, restraint proved more powerful than noise. Patience proved stronger than panic. And in the end, what stunned the Luftwaffe was not the volume of fire, but the silence that came before it.